BioShock Infinite is a masterpiece in every sense. As a game that helped the series come full circle, there's a lot to the game that's aged phenomenally well. To put it simple, BioShock Infinite is without a doubt one of the best games ever and still feels like it. As a game that further improved on the formula of the previous BioShock games, we see a truly marvelous entry that provided enough improvements to make it feel fresh while still riding along the same elements that made the previous BioShock so memorable. It's a combination of excellence and one that I found myself appreciating every step of the way through my return to Columbia. So with that, let's take a look at BioShock Infinite. It's a game that would be once again developed by Irrational Games. BioShock Infinite would be released on March 26, 2013 for the PlayStation 3, the Xbox 360, and Windows, with an OS X version being released months later on August 29th, 2013, and Linux on March 17th, 2015. At the time of its release, the game was met with massive praise, with its Metacritic score being 94 on PC and PS3 and 93 on the Xbox 360. It's worth mentioning that BioShock Infinite is also considered to be one of the greatest games of all time, and a prime example of video games used as a form of art due to the game's art direction, overall atmosphere, and themes involving American exceptionalism. BioShock Infinite would also go on to receive multiple awards and be nominated by several outlets for Game of the Year. Additionally, BioShock Infinite would also get 2 collector's editions. Beginning with the premium edition, which initially cost $79.99, this version would drop with the game, the manual, and a whole lot of extra stuff. This included a book showing the art of BioShock Infinite, a handyman figure that could be used with the BioShock Infinite Siege of Columbia board game, a Murder of Crows Vigor replica keychain, and a Devil's Kiss Vigor lithograph. There would also be a number of extra in-game stuff too, which included gear that could be used in the game to provide an extra starter boost. For example, the extra gear would allow the player to obtain Silver Eagles, the currency of BioShock Infinite, by picking up audio logs. Outside of all that, there would also be the inclusion of extra things like costumes for Xbox 360 avatars and themes for PlayStation and PC players, and also a digital soundtrack. The other edition would be the Songbird edition, which included everything previously mentioned, but also included a statue of Songbird from BioShock Infinite. The Songbird edition would be priced at $149.99. BioShock Infinite would also be included in the BioShock collection as well, with all of its DLC included. The notable ones worth mentioning, since everything else was really just extra stuff that included weapon skins and gear, is Clash in the Clouds and the Burial at Sea episodes. We'll return to Burial at Sea since it's story-related stuff, but as for Clash in the Clouds, it's essentially just a bunch of extra challenge-related stuff. It's not anything special, just wave-based shooting. One last thing to mention before moving on, BioShock Infinite didn't have any multiplayer component like BioShock 2. It was all just single player. That being said, the game's campaign offered more than enough value with a high quality story to make up for it. But anyways, with all of that out of the way, spoilers on the way, because it's time to get into BioShock Infinite. BioShock Infinite begins with brief dialogue between Elizabeth and Booker, where Elizabeth asks Booker if he's afraid of God, prompting a response where he says that he isn't, but he is afraid of her. This leads to a scene with main protagonist Booker DeWitt on a boat with the Lutece twins, who aren't named just yet. We hear them bickering over rowing when they hand Booker a box with a bunch of stuff inside, including a picture of Elizabeth and a gun. The Luteces drop Booker off at a dock and row away, leaving him to journey to a lighthouse with a note on the door stating for Booker to bring them the girl and they'll wipe away the debt. The girl the note is referring to is Elizabeth. Anyways, Booker heads inside the lighthouse, which is pretty empty except for a dead dude. Booker heads to the top, finding a locked door that he opens by solving a puzzle hitting bells. After this, a loud noise happens with the sky turning red and the door opens. Booker finds a red chair inside and then sits down, getting shackled in before the room launches into the air. This is where we are now introduced to the city of Columbia, as Booker is taken to the city's welcome center. Booker heads in where he eventually comes across a bunch of people in robes with a preacher going on about the prophet. Booker accepts a little dip in the water here in order to be allowed entry. At this point, Booker blacks out, hearing a knocking on a door where we see him in an office with someone shouting for him to bring the girl and they'll wipe away the debt. Booker then goes and opens the door to see a city being attacked before he comes to and finds himself in the Garden of New Eden, eventually making his way to Columbia itself. During this section, Booker finds finds himself journeying through the city as a parade goes on, getting stopped by someone who delivers a message that tells Booker to not pick the number 77 and to not alert Comstock. From here, Booker heads on with the goal of heading to Monument Island to find the girl. Along the way, he comes across a mini carnival where he obtains a possession vigor. Booker then goes on where he comes across a small scene with the Lutece twins again, where he flips a coin with it coming up as heads. Shortly after this, Booker finds himself at a raffle with a dude named Jeremiah Fink on stage. Booker is given a free ball to the raffle, coincidentally picking out the number 77. Booker wins the raffle, seeing the prize is to be allowed to throw a ball at a couple. Booker instead attempts to throw the ball at Fink, but is stopped by police. This is where Booker is accused of being the false shepherd after having the mark of AD on his hand discovered. This leads to a bunch of carnage happening, with Booker dropping some dudes with his newly acquired skyhook. From here, Booker fights on, eventually having to deal with this dude on fire. He drops the guy, known as a fireman, getting the Devil's Kiss vigor in the process. After this, Booker fights some more dudes and then heads into the Blue Ribbon. He once again encounters Luteces, where he's given a complimentary shield infusion. Booker continues on, eventually finding himself getting to the Fraternal Order of the Raven building. Making his way through the place dropping dudes, Booker eventually takes an elevator to a section where he fights his first zealot of the lady. He takes this guy out and then gets a murder of Crow's vigor. Continuing on from here, Booker finds that the way to Monument Island is off limits, which leads to him having to use the skyhook to travel across skylines to progress. He eventually comes across another building with a bunch of dudes standing down at the word of Comstock. Booker heads inside, taking an elevator to the top. Comstock pretty much says here that he knows why Booker is there and that not all debts can be repaid. From here, Booker jumps onto Comstock's Zeppelin in order to use it to head to Monument Island. He shifts the rig controls, officially coming across Comstock firsthand. After which, hearing a lady say amen, who incinerates herself, setting the Zeppelin on fire. This leads Booker to have to make his escape to a skyhook, where he finally reaches Monument Island. He eventually reaches an area where Elizabeth is locked up in a place where she's being watched. We also see this little part where she uses a tear to open the way to Paris. Anyways, eventually Booker stumbles across the room by falling into it, startling Elizabeth in the process. Booker tells Elizabeth that he's there to get her out when a statue starts playing a tune. Booker then gives Elizabeth a key to escape the room. The two then make their way out as the place falls apart due to it being attacked by Songbird. Along the way, Elizabeth finds out that she was being watched the whole time when the Songbird comes out of nowhere, eventually having an elevator dropped on it. This allows Booker and Elizabeth to continue as they head up, eventually being knocked off to a skyline by Songbird. Mayhem ensues here, with the skyline eventually falling, causing Booker to fall into some water on Battleship Bay, with Songbird following, attempting to reach at Booker but is stopped with its eye cracking. This leads to Booker blacking out again, showing up in the office again with the pounding on the door. The following scene has Booker coming to on a beach with Elizabeth. Hearing music, Elizabeth runs off and then Booker goes to look for her. Booker eventually comes across Elizabeth dancing with a bunch of random people. He gets her attention by pointing her to a Zeppelin that he claims is going to Paris. Perking up, Elizabeth and Booker now head off to get to the First Lady airship. Continuing forward, the two run into the Lutece twins again, where Elizabeth asks Booker to choose between a bird or a cage pendant. Booker chooses the bird and then they continue on. They come across a checkpoint and then go off to the side, where it's learned that Elizabeth has the ability to pick locks. From here, the pair go on to a gondola station where Booker tries to purchase a ticket to the First Lady airship, but gets stabbed in the hand by the dude at the counter. This leads to them having a fight, with Elizabeth eventually running off after seeing Booker drop a bunch of dudes. Booker pursues Elizabeth, seeing her try to work a gondola to Soldier's Field. Giving her a hand, we see her go on and freak out about Booker's mercilessness, calling him a monster. Booker tells her that the people who went to great length to keep her locked up in the tower wouldn't just let her out. Elizabeth patches up the wound where Booker was stabbed, and then the two continue, eventually being halted after attempting to call a gondola. This leads them to search for a vigor called the shock jockey to start the gondola back up. They're then led to a place where they could find the vigor, the Hall of Heroes. Going up an elevator leading to the area, Booker sees Elizabeth use a tear firsthand. Elizabeth explains them, essentially saying that they're windows to other worlds before Songbird comes out of nowhere, causing her to abruptly close it. After this, they find themselves making it to the Hall of Heroes, eventually coming across a statue of Comstock where it's said that he led a 7th Cavalry. This leads to a man named Slate coming on through a loudspeaker, which prompts Booker and him to have a brief conversation. Booker basically says he just wants a shock jockey and he'll be out of there. This conversation cuts off and Slate sends in some dudes to attack. Booker ices the dudes and then they once again continue on to search for the shock jockey, defeating Slate's men along the way. This leads to a little killing tour where we learn about a few battle displays that Comstock supposedly fought in. After this part, Booker and Elizabeth head to the First Lady's memorial. This is where Elizabeth learns that she is Comstock's daughter and that he wanted her to follow in his footsteps. Eventually, the two make it to another section where they're attacked by a motorized Patriot. Booker destroys the thing, and then the two go on to find a ransacked supply of shock jockey Vigors. Elizabeth says Slate must have taken them, and the two chase after him, fighting some dudes along the way. They eventually come across Slate, who tells Booker to kill him, but Booker refuses, sparing him and then taking the shock jockey Vigor. This leads Booker and Elizabeth to head back to the gondola conduit to power it up. While waiting for the gondola, we hear Comstock, who sends in some dudes, which leads to another fight. Booker eventually drops everything Comstock sends, and then Elizabeth and him ride the gondola to another station, having a conversation during the ride where Booker tells Elizabeth that him busting her out wasn't charity. He essentially just says here that he gambled and came to pay it back. But anyways, the two reach the station and then finally make it to the First Lady airship. While inside, Booker puts in coordinates to New York, which Elizabeth quickly notices and calls out, since the idea was that they were going to go to Paris. Booker pretty much explains to Elizabeth that he owes money and he was offered a way to wipe away the debt in exchange for bringing her to New York. This prompts Elizabeth to let out a fake cry, hitting Booker with a wrench in the process. Fading in and out, Booker sees Elizabeth escape as the Vox Populi group heads into the airship with some dude knocking him out. Booker eventually comes to with Daisy Fitzroy confronting him. At this point, Daisy asks Booker for help getting some guns from a gunsmith, and then Booker gets pushed out of the airship. This leads Booker to head through the area where he pursues Elizabeth. Elizabeth eventually gets captured by some dudes, leaving Booker to head off to save her once again. However, it ends up being Elizabeth who saves him as she opens up a tear to save him from falling off of Columbia after he's knocked off by a handyman. At this moment, Booker goes on to tell Elizabeth that he's made an arrangement to get their airship back in exchange for weapons. This prompts the two to work together again as Elizabeth sees Booker as her only way to get to Paris, and then the two head off to find the gunsmith in Finkton. Along the way, Elizabeth discovers Slate's locker and finds her mother's diary. While reading the thing, she discovers that her mother was the one who locked her in the tower. This is followed by a small scene where Jeremiah Fink gets into contact with Booker on an elevator, saying he's a top candidate. This is followed by the two eventually making it to the gunsmith Chen Lin's place, where they discover it to be empty apart from Lin's wife. She tells them that her husband was taken to the Good Times Club, which is the next destination. While there, Fink tests Booker by having him fight a bunch of dudes. Booker then goes and cleans house, slaughtering everything sent his way. After all this is done, Booker and Elizabeth head down into the building, eventually discovering that Chen Lin is dead. This is followed by the Lutesses coming out of nowhere, saying that Chen Lin is alive in another dimension, which leads Elizabeth opening a tear to another world. Heading back to the gunsmith, they find that the place is completely empty with no tools to make guns, only seeing Chen Lin acting kinda crazy. Heading downstairs, they find Chen Lin's wife, who's a completely different person now. She tells them that the police took Lin's tools to Shantytown, which is the next destination from here. Heading through the slums, doing more fighting, they finally reach the police station, coming across the gunsmith's tools. Knowing that they can't exactly bring back all the tools, another tear is opened, this time in a place where the tools are already back at Chen Lin's. At this point, Elizabeth says that with the Vox getting their weapons, a revolution would begin. Along the way back, we see that Booker is considered a hero of the Vox in this dimension. However, it's learned that Booker also died as a martyr in the world as well. Anyways, heading back, they discover that both Chen Lin and his wife were killed. This leads them to head off to the factory to get the airship and leave. Along the way, we take out an airship by destroying the engine. This is followed by the two heading to Finkton proper to find Daisy as well. While taking an elevator, Daisy contacts Booker saying that her Booker died, which means that he's either an imposter or a ghost. Continuing on, we see Daisy execute Fink and then get the Vox to attack. After this, Elizabeth has Booker distract Daisy after she takes a kid hostage in order for her to get the jump on her. This leads Elizabeth to stab Daisy from behind with a pair of scissors. Eventually making it to the airship, Booker rushes off and sets coordinates with Elizabeth in another part of the ship. She eventually comes out and we find that she's cut her hair and changed her outfit. Hearing a song to summon Songbird, the airship is attacked shortly after, which leads to the two being brought to an area with the Lutesses playing notes to summon Songbird. Elizabeth runs off trying to stop them, but finds out that the instrument was incorrect, which means that they can't just summon Songbird with only the notes. Booker is then given a card for the Songbird defense system, seeing that the Lutesses are now gone after he looks at it. Continuing on, Elizabeth eventually comes to realize who the Lutesses are, saying that they're the ones who invented the technology that allowed Columbia to fly. However, she also says that the two disappeared. Anyways, while searching for a code to unlock an elevator, Songbird gets called again, which leads to Elizabeth asking Booker to not let her be taken back to Comstock. Not long after this, they come across the gates to Comstock House. However, the gate is locked, with Elizabeth being mistaken for Lady Comstock. Seeing that they can't open the door as is, they go to a nearby graveyard where Lady Comstock is located, since they need her fingerprints to open the door. From here, Comstock comes out on a loudspeaker and somehow uses Elizabeth to open a tear and turn Lady Comstock into a ghost. This causes the two to have to fight dead being raised by the lady. After this, the Lutesses show up again, saying that Lady Comstock is neither alive nor dead. The two see some footprints and then follow along, where they're then tasked with finding 3 tears. The next part pretty much has Elizabeth and Booker going across and searching the area for tears. This is pretty much a way to provide additional story details, with things like the Lutesses being killed and Elizabeth being seen as the illegitimate child of Comstock since he was sterile, and also Elizabeth coming to the realization that Lady Comstock's ghost isn't entirely her, it's more of a combination of her and Elizabeth's feelings towards her. After finding all of the tears, the two head back to Comstock's house. This leads the two to have to fight the ghost of Lady Comstock and dead soldiers again. After doing all this, Elizabeth apologizes to the lady, which leads her to help by opening the way to Comstock's house. The next part has Booker and Elizabeth going to a bridge area where Songbird comes and attacks. This causes Booker to be tossed through a window where he's knocked out, once again seeing the Lutesses. Booker then comes to after going through a door in the place, which leads to Songbird busting through the top of the building that Booker was tossed through. Songbird goes to almost kill Booker, which prompts Elizabeth to apologize by telling Songbird to take her home, separating the two. Booker then heads back to the bridge. During this point, Booker is then brought to another dimension, showing the future where it's now snowing. Booker then continues on through the place, hearing Elizabeth through tears. Booker continues on to the warden's office, where he flips a switch to access an elevator. Booker heads back, fighting self along the way, eventually getting to the elevator where he comes across the Lutesses briefly. I believe this is pretty much to confirm that Booker is in fact in the future. Anyways, Booker continues, seeing Elizabeth in the distance, who says that lunatics are running the asylum and that she brought Booker to the future. Booker then takes Elizabeth's hand, seeing that she's an old woman now in the year 1984 and New York is being attacked. The older Elizabeth then gives Booker a note, which she claims is advice to not become her, and then sends Booker back in time. Booker then goes on and sees Elizabeth trapped in a room. This leads to Booker going and saving her again by flipping some levers. Elizabeth then apparently summons a tear that kills the dudes in the room with her. Booker then goes to free Elizabeth and then gives her the note the older Elizabeth gave. She goes on to say that they need to end Comstock, with Booker following up by saying that he'll do it. From here, the two head off to Comstock flagship, the Hand of the Prophet. The two fight their way there, eventually getting to a ship that'll take them to the Hand of the Prophet, but first they need to repel an assault. Anyways, after this, they board the Hand of the Prophet, fighting more dudes and clearing skylines to ride up to the top deck. They eventually reach the Prophet's cabin, where they find and confront Comstock. Elizabeth asks Comstock what she is, and he pretty much says that everything he's done was to keep her safe. Comstock then grabs onto Elizabeth, telling her to ask Booker about what happened to her finger. This prompts Booker to grab Comstock and bash his head and then drown him in a nearby basin. Elizabeth asks Booker what Comstock meant about her finger, causing him to respond by saying that he didn't know. After this, the two then go off to figure out a way to destroy a siphon. But before they could do anything else, the Vox comes and attacks. This causes Elizabeth to call the Songbird to help eliminate the Vox ships. This part is pretty much just destroying Vox Zeppelin so Booker and Elizabeth can make it to Monument Island. After this part, Booker and Elizabeth head to the bow of the ship and order the Songbird to destroy the siphon. This causes Songbird to lose control, almost attacking the two before Elizabeth teleports them underwater to Rapture, where Songbird dies. The next part should be familiar to anyone who's played the first BioShock, since it's the introduction area of the game. Anyways, the two then take a bathysphere, seeing the city while going back to the surface, where Booker calls a city under the ocean ridiculous. After this, the two are then taken to a nearby lighthouse. They go to the entrance of the lighthouse, and then Elizabeth finds a key that kind of just appears. She uses it, and then Booker opens a door, where they're then taken to another dimension with a bunch of lighthouses. Booker asks what they are, and Elizabeth responds by telling him that they're other worlds with constants and variables. There's always a man and there's always a lighthouse, with all them leading to the place where it all started. They continue on from here to another lighthouse, where we go on to see an area where Booker says he was after a wounded knee. The preacher tells Booker to take his hand hand and Booker goes to accept the baptism. However, he hesitates here and we find out Booker didn't actually go through with it. Booker freaks out, telling Elizabeth to open a tear to Paris to be done with this, but Elizabeth says not until they find Comstock. Booker says Comstock is dead, which Elizabeth says nope to. Entering another door, we see that Robert Lutece was actually the one who hired Booker. From here, we see Booker go into another room where we find a crib with a baby. However, Booker claims that there was never a baby there at all. Elizabeth says that Booker doesn't leave the room until he gives the girl, which prompts Booker to eventually give in to hand the Lutece the baby. After this, we see Booker back on the boat where Elizabeth says, "Bring us the girl and wipe away the debt." Booker says here that the deal was to actually get Elizabeth. They eventually make it to the pier where Booker was at the beginning of the game, and Booker pretty much says that they should just leave because Comstock is dead. Elizabeth says nope again because Comstock is alive in a million worlds and that it won't actually be over until Comstock never lived in the first place. The two head to another world where we see Comstock trying to pull a baby through a portal that closes, causing her finger to be severed. This leads to Booker being back in his office where we see that the AD stands for Anna DeWitt. Booker is then brought to another world by the Luteces where it's explained that Booker forms new memories with his old ones in the world. We then hear Elizabeth telling Booker to wake up as he is once again on the boat. Booker explains that he sold Elizabeth, which gets a response from Rosalind saying that he actually tried to weasel his way out. Booker goes on from here saying that he's gonna go back to when Comstock was born and smother him in his crib. Elizabeth and Booker then head to another door, which leads them back to the area where Booker refused the baptism. This is where we find out that Booker was born again in other dimensions as Comstock. This leads to Booker being drowned by a bunch of Elizabeths, killing him in the end. The scene then goes on to show the Elizabeths disappearing one by one, and that is the end of BioShock Infinite. Giving my last thoughts of BioShock Infinite's campaign, I have to say there's a lot that I still appreciate. That being said, I think that there's some flaws now that I don't think particularly age too hot either, though this comes from more of the gameplay side, which I'll swing back to. As for the story, I do have an appreciation for the bond that's built up between Booker and Elizabeth. I also feel like the growth of Elizabeth throughout the story is an interesting touch too. At the beginning, she seems more apprehensive and oblivious. She's essentially kind of living in her own world, probably due to being locked up for so long, and by the end of the game, she has a lot more determination and is almost hardened in a way. I would assume that this was something caused by coming to the realization that she was essentially exploited by Comstock and how terrible her surroundings and treatment would end up throughout the game. There's also a lot of random symbolism throughout the game that I don't think I could do as much justice explaining as much as others might, but one obvious example is the bird in the cage choice for Elizabeth's pendant. It probably depends on interpretation, but one could assume that the bird could mean that Elizabeth is allowed a level of freedom, and the cage would be viewed as a form of imprisonment. Though I guess it could depend on how you view it as a player. But that's really my main thoughts here. Let's continue. Gameplay of BioShock Infinite is a bit different from its predecessors in some ways. For starters, any of the horror-ish elements of the previous games are now non-existent. The game also fully embraces a more action-oriented approach, as there's more emphasis on picking up and replacing guns, since you can't hold on to weapons in the same way as BioShock 1 and 2. That being said, things like the health kits are no longer in the base game, as you now get things like the shield, which regenerates when not taking any damage. This is something that can be upgraded by finding infusions. Infusions act as the player's way to upgrade shields, health, and Eve. Speaking of Eve, you have the Vigors too, which essentially work the same way as plasmids in BioShock 1 and 2. These can be swapped around more freely now versus how they were in the previous games, where you need to hit up a gene bank in order to change them. Additionally, you also have equipment gear swapped to make up for the lack of tonics that normally provided extra buffs. Most of these work the same way in the sense that they provide survivability upgrades to the player, along with other extra caveats. For example, you might find a piece of gear that would allow you to reload quicker. It's also worth mentioning that you do get a partner in BioShock Infinite as well. This changes the whole quiet protagonist thing from the first two games, as Booker and Elizabeth converse throughout the game. It's a way that helps strengthen the story as well, since the two do form a bond as you progress through the story. But it isn't all just about narrative, since Elizabeth can actually find items for Booker. She can also pick locks as well, though you do need lock picks for things that are outside of story required paths. One last thing too, the game utilizes a weapon called the Skyhook to traverse areas by essentially grinding on rails. You can use this thing to access areas that might be inaccessible otherwise as well, since you could use it to get to high places by attaching to hooks. And like I said, this thing doubles down as a weapon too. It's essentially the melee of BioShock Infinite and can act like a finisher too. It's not nearly as fun as something like the drill in BioShock 2, but the executions do at least look pretty freaking cool. Like I mentioned before, you can't carry around a whole armory with you in BioShock Infinite, instead swapping between two weapons. So you do have the option to pick up other weapons off the ground. There's plenty of interesting stuff to fight with at least. You get yourself pistols, machine guns, rocket launchers, shotties. There's honestly a lot to cover here, so I'll just name off some of my favorite and least favorite weapons. I personally like the crank gun and the sniper rifle the most. Both of these felt like a treat to use and seemed like they'd eat up enemy health real quick. The crank gun in particular was super useful no matter where I used it and just felt beast. As for the worst weapons, well, I'm giving this to either the pistol or the burst gun. The pistol is at least excused as what is basically a starter weapon. I didn't really feel like it was worth using beyond the occasional pickup if I was out of ammo with stuff like the shotty or the machine gun. But what really sucked was the burst gun. You don't come across these too much until around what feels like the middle of the game too. Everything about it feels weak, and it really doesn't justify ever picking up due to just about every other weapon seeming like a better option. This is even with upgrades, which I haven't even gone over yet. In BioShock Infinite, you're also able to upgrade weapons using money. You can do this at vending machines. I gotta be completely honest though, upgrading weapons in BioShock Infinite feels like a waste of money outside of weapon damage because of how quickly you find yourself picking up new stuff when you run out of ammo. That being said, it is still worth buying upgrades for the Vigors. Since Vigors are something that feels like the true meat of BioShock Infinite, I feel like it's worth covering my favorites more than the ones I use less frequently. Starting with Possession, this is easily the best Vigor in the game. This lets you take control of enemies, allowing them to fight for you. Upgrades for this are particularly useful since they'll let you use it for less Eve and also cause enemies to KO themselves after it runs out. Murder of Crows is pretty solid too. I particularly like this one because it attacks as sort of like a mix of the bees in the previous games, but on steroids, plus crows, right? Shock Jockey is also pretty solid too. This essentially works in the same way as Electrobolt from the previous games in that the shock of the Vigor stuns enemies. Undertow and Return to Sender I found useful at times too. Undertow is fun to use when you're knocking enemies off at Columbia, which is essentially an insta-kill, and Return to Sender is best used for nice bursts on enemies. Other than this, you also have things like Bucking Bronco, a Vigor that causes enemies to float up in the air. Charge, this thing basically has you run into enemies. Devil's Kiss, this thing is basically like Incinerate from the previous BioShock games in that it burns up enemies. I don't think any of the Vigors are bad, but I think that there's some personal preference since, like I said, I mainly use Possession because that was always the one that clicked with me. Anyways, continuing on, we have BioShock Infinite's types of enemies too. You get the standard stuff, soldier enemies with melee weapons and enemies with guns. Some enemies could be aligned with the Founders and some could be aligned with the Vox. There's also an armored-like enemy who uses explosives called Beast too. They're basically what feels like the spongiest of normal enemies. There's also security enemies who use either rockets or guns, but then there's also these flying things called mosquitoes. But beyond that, there are a lot of more unique enemies who have their own kind of powers too. Going over some, the Fireman is essentially an armored dude who is, well, on fire. Zealot of the Lady, these dudes are holding coffins on their back and utilize the Crow Vigor. There's also the Handyman. These are really huge dudes with a big opening on their heart area, which is their main weak point. You don't see these guys too often, so fights with them can be kind of hectic when they do show up. Same goes for the Motorized Patriots. These dudes are pretty strong too, and their weakness is on their back. I compared them more to being the Big Daddy replacement, though when you drop the Patriots, you get the crank gun. Moving on to more of the game, it's worth mentioning things like the game's setting and atmosphere too. I'd say that BioShock Infinite excels here in the sense that Columbia really drives home that old Americana-esque lifestyle. The game just screams it with things like the Motorized Patriot enemies too, things that represent United States presidents of the past. What really stands out though is just how beautiful Columbia actually is. It's vivid, colorful, and looks warming. The game starts out almost ominously too, with the storm surrounding the lighthouse and the state of things inside, so it's kind of unexpected when you actually reach Columbia itself. It feels like a welcoming place with celebration happening and song and dance. Really, everything is peachy up until the moment where Booker is exposed as being the false shepherd. After this, we see the city gradually decay with war and turmoil. The whole place pulls a 180 before our very eyes, and we watch Columbia fall apart more and more as we progress. It's a good example of how quick things can change. The music in the game is pretty good too. Like I said, not really horror sounding stuff, but there is a lot of action-y sounding tracks, with several for Columbia battles. What I will say though is that there are a lot of different pieces that feel like they fit the time period of the game. It's a whole different vibe from Rapture's tracks, but I will highlight that I enjoyed the tracks Solace and Saddle the Pony. Don't know why, but these ones just stood out a lot more than the other stuff. It also shouldn't be too surprising when I say the voice acting is also top-notch in the game too. Troy Baker and Courtney Draper in particular do great jobs with Booker and Elizabeth. I think I could have seen more from some characters, like Comstock for example. I don't know what it is entirely, but I don't think he stands out as much as someone like Andrew Ryan or even Atlas. Like sure, he's evil in his own ways, but I don't feel like he's as memorable as previous villains or even as much as both Booker and Elizabeth. Either way, everyone in the game has a solid performance, even on things like the audio log, which again make a return and help provide extra lore and details within the game world. But that's about it here. So what issues do I find BioShock Infinite to really have? Well, by comparison, I think that the combat feels a little weaker than BioShock 2. I'd say that it's still just as fluid for the most part, but I don't find things like meleeing to be nearly as enjoyable. The skyhook is cool, but I don't like it as much as the drill from the second game, nor the wrench from the first. What I can at least appreciate though is the finishers. They're pretty cool and definitely brutal, but I don't feel like they make up for the other shortcomings. I'd also say that not being able to lug around more than 2 weapons in the base game is kinda eh. This is something that actually changes in the DLC, which we'll come back to, but it makes upgrading weapons feel almost pointless. Upgrading Vigors is still worth it, but doing anything other than popping off damage increases felt like a waste of money in the game, especially since you end up swapping into new weapons when you run out of ammo more often than holding on to guns just because they're cool. I think I understand the intention of trying to get people to use more weapons, but really, it's more of an inconvenience over anything else. I'd also say that the game has a tendency to drag out a bit too. The easiest thing I could point to off the top of my head is during a section where you need to find multiple tears, which leads to a kind of tedious backtracking portion that includes a part where you need to run through a bank. I don't know why, but I felt like this section was slow and could have easily been cut since the flow feels off here. Don't get me wrong, I love BioShock Infinite, but after replaying the game multiple times, I felt weirdly annoyed at this section in particular. There's nothing that really stands out other than this stuff, and it might just be a personal thing over anything else, but I thought this was worth mentioning. Anyways, pulling back again, we have one last thing to cover. Burial at Sea episodes 1 and 2. In episode 1, you play as Booker, and in episode 2, you play as Elizabeth. So with that, I'll recap the story of both episodes first, and then move on to any thoughts and differences in gameplay between the two afterwards, since there are some things that are recycled in the episodes. But anyways, if you want to avoid recap spoilers, skip ahead to the time on the screen. Burial at Sea begins with some familiar but brief distorted voices and Booker sleeping in an office. He comes to, seeing a woman enter. This turns out to be Elizabeth, who tells Booker that there's a girl who needs to be found. Booker says the girl is dead. However, Elizabeth responds by saying that she isn't and that she'll pay Booker to help find the girl. This leads Booker to following Elizabeth so that he could ask more about the girl, whose name is Sally. Elizabeth says that she doesn't know where she is, but she knows someone who does. This leads Booker into following her as they head to the Garden of the Muses. Along the way, we learn that Sally was taken while Booker was gambling, after which Sally would be found floating in some docks. Booker then has a little flashback, and then the two continue on to Sander Cohen's. However, they aren't allowed entrance until they find an initiation mask. This leads to the two searching multiple stores in order to find one. After finding the mask, the two return to Cohen's, finally gaining entry. Once there, we see Cohen painting some people dancing who end up getting shocked afterwards. afterwards. Booker and Elizabeth ask Cohen if he's seen Sally. Cohen goes on to say that he knows where the girl is, but first he wants a dance. This leads to Booker and Elizabeth dancing for him. However, they are interrupted by a distraught Cohen who has them both shocked unconscious. Booker then comes to with Elizabeth waking him up as the two find themselves in a bathysphere heading to Fontaine's department store, which is an area of Rapture that was sunken into being a prison. Anyways, getting to the area, Booker finds an air grabber, which is just the skyhook from the base game, and uses it to get further into the department store. However, Booker gets stuck and we see a splicer come out of nowhere and freeze a spout of water, which allows Elizabeth and Booker to cross. After this, Elizabeth points out the house where is part of Fontaine's, which is where Sally is said to be. The two then head to find a tram station in order to continue. Unfortunately, their journey is cut short as they now need to find a plasmid in order to freeze a path in order to access the tram area. This leads to the two searching for Old Man Winter in the Rapture on Ice area. Once there, Booker and Elizabeth fight a bunch of splicers, opening a display case afterwards where they find that there isn't any Old Man Winter left. Elizabeth then opens up a tear where we are able to obtain an untouched Old Man Winter. Booker asks how she was able to do that, and Elizabeth says that it's a new plasmid. After this, the two make it to the tram area, taking a bathysphere to Housewares. While traveling, Booker fesses up saying that he gambles and that he lost Sally while gambling. He then asks Elizabeth what Sally is to her, which prompts her to respond by saying that she has an interest in reuniting the two. Upon exiting the bathysphere, the two see a splicer going after Sally, who goes and hides in a vent. In order to get Sally out here, however, Elizabeth comes up with a plan to close a number of vents and turn up the central heating to force her out. This next part is the two pretty much going around closing vents. After this, Elizabeth and Booker head to the thermostat to pump up the heat and get Sally to come out of an exhaust vent. They do this and then head to the exhaust where Booker tries to get Sally out. However, this prompts a Big Daddy to come and attack. Booker then fights the thing, going off to rescue Sally after by grabbing her. However, Booker has some flashbacks here, which is followed by Elizabeth telling him to let the girl go. This is where we also see that the girl was presumably killed as a portal closed on her head. Booker then says that he remembers all of it, which leads to Elizabeth calling him Comstock, saying that Sally and her weren't his. The Lutesses then briefly show up for a moment, saying for Booker to return to them to solve his problem, which leads to another flashback, basically explaining that Booker was sent to a place where he might forget about Anna. This leads to Booker apologizing to Elizabeth, where he's impaled with a Big Daddy drill from behind, which leads to the end of episode 1. Burial at Sea episode 2 begins with a small audio recap of the finale of the previous episode before switching to Elizabeth, who is now in Paris. She's given a drawing of herself as she looks onto the Eiffel Tower before heading on through the streets. Eventually, she comes across a girl with a balloon who turns out to be Sally. She chases after the girl as the scene goes from looking bright and warming to dark and dreary. Elizabeth is eventually led to Booker's office, entering to see the thermostat from the previous episode and turning around to see Sally. Elizabeth then sees a bunch of vents with Sally burning up inside of them before blacking out and then coming to next to a deceased Booker. This is where Elizabeth sees Atlas firsthand as a dude tries to fire a gun in her face. At this point, Elizabeth sees Booker in a chair playing a guitar where she's told to say that she can get Atlas back to Rapture. This is able to catch Atlas's attention. Booker then has Elizabeth say that she is Suchong's assistant. This leads to a deal between the two where Elizabeth helps Atlas in exchange for Sally. Atlas lets Elizabeth go in the end, but not before making sure she clocks out so that he can make a getaway. But anyways, she comes to again and then exit the toy department in search of Dr. Suchong. However, while going to move some rubble, she comes across another version of herself who had been killed by a Big Daddy. At this moment, she also realizes that her pinky is entirely back as well. This leads to a flashback with Elizabeth on board a boat with the Lutesses. At this moment, Elizabeth tells them that she needs to go back to fix everything. We also find out that she did in fact die in the department store as well. Elizabeth is then dropped off at the lighthouse where she enters, bringing us back to the current point where it's also discovered that she can no longer open tears and is basically normal now. Continuing on, Elizabeth eventually makes her way to a different area where she stealthily knocks some dudes out. Not long after this, she finds a crossbow, dropping some splicers afterwards. After this part, Elizabeth deduces that to find Suchong, she needs to start at the Silverfin restaurant. Along the way, she grabs the Peeping Tom plasmid, which allows her to see through walls and walk around camouflaged. After this, she takes an elevator while continuing to talk to Booker, which Atlas calls out, basically saying that she sounds crazy. After this, Elizabeth goes on to pick up the possession plasmid and then continues on to find schematics for Fontaine's department store. At this moment, she discovers that she can use ducks to get to Suchong's. Finally getting to the Silverfin, Elizabeth discovers that Suchong knew about Columbia, Booker, and even her. She also discovers that Suchong also has a tear that leads to Columbia. Communicating with Booker, Elizabeth says that she can use a Lutece particle to make the department store rise. However, in order to do so, she has to make it back to Columbia. But first, she has to repair the Lutece device in order to do so. And so she goes off to find replacement parts and an old man winter plasmid to restore it. However, before she can leave the Silverfin, she's stopped by Suchong, who locks her in, accusing her of sabotage. Elizabeth tells him that she's going to fix the machine, and he allows her to go. After this, she goes on to find the parts and the plasmid. Returning to Suchong's after this, she repairs the Lutece device and then heads to Columbia by entering the tear, which brings her to the First Lady airship. She goes on from here to find a spare quantum particle on the ship and then heads back to the tear. However, before she can return, she's stopped by Suchong. Suchong tells her that he wants a lock of hair from Fink's lab. Elizabeth then goes on through Columbia, traveling through some vents where she discovers Lutece is having a conversation with Daisy Fitzroy. While eavesdropping on the conversation, we see that Daisy was supposed to put in motion key events like turning Elizabeth into a killer by having Daisy sacrifice her and die at the hands of Elizabeth in order to allow the Vox Revolution to succeed. Anyways, after this, Elizabeth continues on, finding a clock key to open some doors to Fink's lab. She does this, opening the way to an elevator where she sees another version of herself along with Booker. Eventually getting to Fink's lab, we see that Suchong and Fink were working together. We also see that Big Daddies and Little Sisters work the same way as Elizabeth and Songbird. There's also some more backstory to show how Elizabeth became tied with Songbird as well. But anyways, after all of this, Elizabeth eventually finds a hair sample, which turns out to be her own hair. She then goes on to return to the tear, coming across the aftermath of Booker and her other versions fighting, as well as a now deceased Daisy Fitzroy. Elizabeth then jumps into the tear where she's brought back to Suchong's. Upon returning, there also appears to be fighting going on, which Suchong says isn't relevant to their arrangement. Elizabeth goes on and drops the hair into a pneumo tube. However, this whole thing is interrupted by Andrew Ryan coming on the screen and confronting Elizabeth. He says here that he didn't invite Elizabeth into the city and that Suchong wasn't authorized to make a deal with her. Ryan pretty much tries to make a deal with Elizabeth here. However, she is adamant on saving Sally. His response leads to Ryan sending in a bunch of splicers to attack. Elizabeth defends herself, dropping everything thrown at her. Atlas then contacts Elizabeth, asking what her plan is. She tells him that she could get the building to float in Frank Fontaine's office. Heading there, Booker and Ryan both contact Elizabeth, essentially saying that Atlas is going to betray her. Once at the office, Elizabeth places the quantum particle in the center of the room, which causes the building to float. This leads to a bunch of dudes surrounding her, where she's knocked unconscious. In this next scene, we see Elizabeth being asked where something called an ace in the hole is. She's then given a truth serum, which doesn't get anything out of her. Elizabeth goes unconscious after, which is followed by a scene showing herself in front of a mirror where we hear events happening in Rapture, like the bombing of the Kashmir restaurant. When she comes to, she's greeted by Atlas, who tells her she was out for 2 weeks. This is followed by Atlas torturing Elizabeth for information on something called the ace in the hole. Realizing he can't get anything out of her, Atlas brings in Sally. This gets Elizabeth to frantically say that she doesn't know anything. This is followed with her blacking out again and being led by Booker to a location where the ace in the hole presumably is. Booker then disappears and we see Elizabeth take Sally's hand, which causes her to come to. Coming to, Elizabeth tells Atlas that the ace in the hole is in Suchong's clinic. Atlas then takes Elizabeth to the Artemis Suite area, where she goes on to Suchong's clinic, finding an injured Big Daddy blocking the way. She then goes around looking for notes on how to repair it. This eventually leads to her discovering that the Big Daddy needs Adam in order to be healed. After this, some nearby Little Sisters give the Big Daddy Adam, which heals it, allowing Elizabeth to continue on. After this, Elizabeth then heads to Suchong's, where she sees a Big Daddy kill Suchong after he slaps a Little Sister. Elizabeth then heads to Suchong's body, where she finds the ace in the hole, and then returns to Atlas. She gives Atlas the ace, calls him a rube, and then Atlas rewards her by bashing her in the face with a wrench. We then see Elizabeth having a vision of Jack on the plane in BioShock 1, and then she goes on to tell Atlas the activation code, which is the "would you kindly" phrase. Atlas then bashes Elizabeth again, which knocks her out into seeing the events of BioShock 1. This scene is followed by Elizabeth saying that she could see Jack, the BioShock 1 protagonist, protagonist, leading the little sisters off of a bathysphere, after which she comes to with Sally at her side before passing out and presumably dying. And that, my friends, is the end of Burial at Sea Episode 2. When it comes to summarizing all my feelings of the BioShock Burial at Sea episodes, I think that I found episode 2 to be the better of the two. Burial at Sea episode 1 felt pretty much like an introduction to kick things off. It's a very short episode, honestly only taking a couple hours to complete. It's okay, but the ending feels like kind of a slap in the face until you really understand what is actually happening based on interpretation. It's like Elizabeth just sort of seemed like she was finishing a job with the tone of how she reacts to Booker getting gutted at the end of the first episode. However, with episode 2, I think this is where we really seem to see some real development happening over just a quick vendetta. Elizabeth seems to question herself more and more with regret, and we see her sanity gradually fall apart after what feels like a bright start with her finally being in Paris. But then she eventually gets brought back to reality in Rapture, where things are essentially a nightmare. By the end of episode 2, we also see development in Elizabeth's regret in her actions too, something that she was trying to make up for by saving Sally, someone that she really has no reason to help at all. It was like a way of trying to get personal redemption in the same way that Booker was trying to get redemption while saving Elizabeth. Everything has a way of coming about in full circle, and we see that these events are what sets off what would eventually happen in BioShock 1 too. It's a fantastic way to end the game, and really one that I appreciated. I'd also say that the voice acting was still great too, and I really love that they brought back the same voice actors of Atlas and Andrew Ryan. Really kept it consistent, and their performances were absolutely perfect. One thing I really wish that they would have done though is added some stuff that had to do with Sophia Lamb in the audio logs or something. Even if it was something small, I feel like it would have helped consistency to make BioShock 2 not feel as retconny. A lot of the gameplay for Burial at Sea was the same as the base BioShock Infinite experience and stays mostly the same throughout both episodes too. There is a few things that I can at least mention though, like I could at least appreciate that you now had the ability to carry more than 2 guns. I was also appreciative that we saw the return of the freeze plasmid with Old Man Winter. This was easily my favorite plasmid from the first 2 BioShock games, and I honestly still found it fun to shatter enemies. Episode 1 pretty much feels like the same old game except with this setting of Rapture. The main difference really comes with episode 2 of Burial at Sea, which relies on more of a stealth emphasis as you play as Elizabeth here. Additionally, there's also the introduction of a new lockpicking minigame that sort of works the same way as the hacking minigame in BioShock 2. Red is the alarm, blue gives noisemakers, and white just completes the minigame. It's okay, but nothing really all that groundbreaking. Lastly, episode 2 also brings back first aid kits from the first 2 games as well, meaning you can now carry around these to restore health if you take damage. Again, not really a huge difference, but it is at least worth mentioning the change. You also get a few new weapons in Burial at Sea too. The machine gun from the original game makes a return, and a really strong one at that. It feels way more powerful than I remember this gun feeling in the original BioShock, and honestly was my favorite gun to use. Other than that, you also get the radar range. This thing shoots a beam that cooks up enemies. It's pretty strong, but you use up ammo with it super quick. During episode 2, you also get the crossbow. This isn't exactly the same as the crossbow from the first game, though it is still pretty effective. It's a stealth weapon that puts enemies to sleep. What I really liked doing was using the noisemaker rounds and then the gas rounds to put groups of enemies to sleep when they'd end up being distracted. Either way, nice little change of pace weapon. You also get a set of new plasmids and Vigors in the DLC too. I mentioned that episode 1 introduces the Old Man Winter freeze to the game. This essentially works the same way as Winter Blast, as it freezes up enemies, allowing you to shatter them. Episode 2 introduces more new stuff too, though I found the stuff here to be a lot less interesting. The Peeping Tom plasmid allows you to turn invisible, and Ironsides gives you a shield that gives you ammo back. I did use Peeping Tom a couple times, but Ironsides I don't think I bothered with. Burial at Sea also introduces an enemy unique to the BioShock universe. We see the return of the splicers from the original BioShock, but there's also a new variant called the Frosty Splicer. These dudes are essentially immune to Old Man Winter and have a lot of health. Not a lot to say about them, but I wanted to at least point out their inclusion. So with everything mentioned, I have to say that BioShock Infinite is still quite good. I don't really know if I like it more than 1 and 2, but I will say that it's at least pretty fun to play. I also love the art direction of Columbia too. It's a very pretty looking game, and honestly, it looks a lot better than a lot of other games that kind of feel like they just blend in together. BioShock Infinite stands out due to how colorful the game looks, and I'd say that it's aged phenomenally well. I don't feel like the setting of Columbia is as interesting as something like Rapture, but I still enjoy it. It's interesting to see the gradual downfall of the city and really how quickly war changes it. We've seen the BioShock games trend from being more horror-ish oriented games where you feel sort of alone to what feels like more modernized shooters with high emphasis on action and cinematics. I don't think that's a bad thing, but it sure feels like it changes a lot. What I do at least have an appreciation of is how everything ties in together by the end of the DLCs, and the games come full circle with Burial at Sea tying into the eventual events of BioShock 1. It made me appreciate the DLC of Infinite far more than on initial glance, but where we end is really with questions. BioShock is a franchise that hasn't been touched in forever. It's a shame to let the IP rot, but what can you do? Maybe Judas will get us back to where we were with the BioShock games, but we'll just have to wait and see. But for now, the BioShock games are something that we could still go back to and appreciate. They're great titles and still definitely worth revisiting. Thank you all for watching. It's been a fun ride going through the BioShock games, but we're now ready to move along. If you made it this far, why not give a like and also subscribe too? By the time you're hearing this, I'm probably already working on another video, so stick around. There's more to come. Anyways, thank you all for watching, and I hope you all stay safe. Thank you all for the support. Until next time, peace out.